Hey there, and welcome to Beyond Borders, the Immigration Evaluation Podcast. If you're a mental health professional looking to expand your practice and make a meaningful impact by conducting immigration psychological evaluations, you're in the right place. I'm Dr. Mariela Shibley, and on this podcast, we dive into the ins and outs of conducting immigration evaluations, helping you grow your practice while helping families stay together. So let's get into it. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the world of immigration evaluations. We'll explore what these assessments are, how they differ from other types of psychological evaluations, and why they play such a crucial role in the lives of immigrant families. We're going to discuss their impact on legal outcomes and how they can help bring objectivity to a system that can sometimes be quite biased. So this episode will give you a solid overview of immigration evaluation and the vital work that professionals in this field can do to support individuals and families navigating the complexities of the immigration process. When a person is involved in an immigration proceeding, sometimes they need to substantiate their claim of, say, hardship or substantial harm as part of their immigration process. So, for example, some cases, an individual is facing a potential ban from entering the country or returning to the country once they leave for what's usually about 10 years. And the only way to waive that ban is to show that their loved one, more specifically their spouse or their parent or sometimes a child, would suffer, quote unquote, extreme hardship if they had to separate, if this individual weren't allowed to stay in the U.S. So one way to prove that hardship is, in addition to other documents and other hardships in other areas, is a psychological evaluation, where a mental health professional will explain how, based on this person's characteristics, their history, their symptoms, if they have any, this is how we anticipate that they would suffer if they were separated from their loved one. Another typical situation is someone who's been the victim of a crime. So what they need to demonstrate is that they suffered substantial harm as a result of that crime. And that would allow them to be granted what's called a U visa. So oftentimes there are no physical scars, so it's the emotional scars that really go a long way and that are very hard to show because, again, there may not be records of treatment and clearly there's nothing that you can show in a picture. So going to a mental health professional to do this evaluation and really be able to explain the impact that the crime had on the person, that can oftentimes be the vital element of evidence in a case because, again, they lack other substantial evidence. Same with individuals who are survivors of intimate partner violence. They need to prove that they were subject to extreme cruelty by their U.S. resident or U.S. citizen spouse, and that some, in a lot of these cases, they don't even have a police report to substantiate that. So having an evaluation with a mental health professional who can, in a very well-written report, explain the impact that this abuse had on them and perhaps even get into more of the quality of the abuse can be really, really helpful in these cases. There's other cases like asylum, for example, who, these are people who've been persecuted or who fear future persecution in their country of citizenship. And sometimes those individuals need to show how this affected them, how having been persecuted, or for some people tortured, the harm that it caused to substantiate their fear of returning to their country. Sometimes in these cases, there are issues around credibility because a lot of these cases are handled in court and their testimony might contradict other testimony or they might contradict themselves in court. It might be inconsistent with some records. So the attorney will encourage them to get more evidence to be able to explain why these inconsistencies that could be due to trauma, it could just be their presentation, can actually be the result of, say, post-traumatic stress, for example. So there's a lot of different situations where an immigration evaluation would be beneficial for an individual who's undergoing an immigration process. Now, these evaluations are quite different from other types of psychological assessments or conducted in other clinical forensic settings. So, whereas other types of psychological assessments might focus on identifying and diagnosing mental health conditions or developing personalized treatment plans or assessing for learning or intellectual disabilities, in immigration evaluations, the goal of the evaluation is to answer a very specific question or questions that are typically guided by the type of immigration case that a person is involved in. So, for example, as I was saying before, in the case of a hardship evaluation, as we would call it for short, what they need to prove is that if they were not allowed to stay in the U.S., this is if they're already here in the U.S. Sometimes they're already separated, but at any rate, how this is impacting or will impact their loved one, who, again, in most cases is either a spouse or a parent or sometimes a child. So that is a referral question. How would it affect them in the case of a separation or a relocation if their loved one were to move abroad in order to stay together? In other situations, for example, for the U visa, the question is, did this person suffer substantial harm as a result of the crime that they were a victim of? So the question is not so much on what happened, but more on how it affected them and was it something substantial. Now, I'll come back to those words, substantial and extreme and such. But anyway, those are just two examples where it's really the psycho-legal question that guides the assessment. So again, whereas perhaps someone is used to doing an evaluation to arrive at a diagnosis, sometimes in these cases, the person may not meet criteria for a diagnosis, but that's okay because you can still answer the referral question in a way that can be very beneficial for their case, even though they may not currently meet criteria for a diagnosis and they may not be needing treatment right now. Because again, if you're talking about something that happened in the past, maybe a long time ago, they did suffer back then, but they're not suffering now. And that's okay, because the point is, did they suffer as a result of the crime, not if they're still suffering? Same with these hardship waivers. Would they suffer is the question. So right now, if they're still together, nothing's changed, then it's understandable that they wouldn't be presenting with symptoms that would together warrant a diagnosis. So it is the referral question what guides the evaluation. What you focus on, what you hone in on, what you end up including and emphasizing in the report is all in response to that referral question, which again, it's different depending on the type of case and each individual case as well, because there are some standards for certain types of evaluations, like for a hardship waiver, which we need to explore how a separation from their loved one or a relocation would affect them. But perhaps in that particular case, the attorney also wants you to focus on and explain, say, a prior charge for a battery or something like that. So it's very important to be clear about the purpose of the report. Quick break. If you love what you're hearing and want to get started with immigration evaluations, grab my free introductory guide to immigration evaluations. It's linked in the description box, and it is packed with everything you need to know about the different types of evaluations, writing strong reports, and avoiding common pitfalls. Download it now. Now let's get back to the episode. Immigration is so complex, and each case is just so different that even though you might have a pretty good idea of what this evaluation entails, like what the referral question is, being open to perhaps there's something else that needs to be addressed from a legal standpoint, because that's the whole purpose of the report, is to answer that psycho-legal question. So because immigration evaluations involve a blend of psychological and legal perspectives, it's very important that the evaluator have a general understanding of the legal case that the client is involved in. Not having this basic understanding could result in a number of problems, anywhere from not addressing important factors to over-focusing on issues that are irrelevant to the case or just straight up damaging a case. So one common mistake that evaluators often make, for example, is giving too much emphasis on the diagnosis. So they might evaluate a client for a U visa who was a survivor of a crime and then get caught up on the fact that the person doesn't currently meet criteria for a DSM diagnosis. Well, if you understand what the referral question for a U visa is, then you would know that what the client needs to prove is that they suffered substantial harm as a result of the crime. So if the crime occurred years ago, or if the person received timely treatment, then it's very likely that they won't currently struggle with symptoms that warrant a psychiatric diagnosis. But that doesn't mean that they weren't affected by the crime. And you can write a very powerful report where you may even point out that they don't currently suffer from a mental disorder, but that based on the reported symptoms and the evidence, etc., that they did suffer from, say, acute stress disorder following the crime years ago. And there are so many other factors that you could emphasize in the report that would be extremely helpful in substantiating their claim, like changes before and after the crime, changes in their personality and their ways of being in the world, a sense of safety, their ability to trust others. Those are all also very important factors to consider that are not necessarily symptoms that meet criteria for a diagnosis. But again, if you don't know this about this type of case, then you can end up, at best, not emphasizing the answer to that psycho-legal question, and at worst, perhaps turning the client away and refusing to write a report because you don't think that it would be favorable to them. Immigration evaluations can sometimes literally make or break a case. In many cases, individuals have very little objective evidence to substantiate their claims. And what we can provide as mental health professionals can significantly influence the decision-making process of these immigration officials. I've heard attorneys say that we could be saying the same thing that the client is saying, but the fact that it's coming from a mental health professional has so much more weight. Now, this is not to say that just repeating what your client tells us is enough. There's a reason they come to a mental health professional, because we can provide much more than just a narrative, but it's still a factor in these cases. And this brings me to the core of my work, the reason behind my passion for this work. Our immigration system is quite biased. Not only is it pretty arbitrary who gets to apply for a green card. So, for example, a foreign national who recently came to the U.S. to marry a U.S. citizen can be granted permanent residency. But a student who spent the last 6 years in the U.S. studying and was awarded a master's degree from a U.S. institution, unless they're able to secure a job that will sponsor them, which costs a lot of money, is not allowed to stay in the U.S. But also, even in these immigration cases, an applicant has to prove extreme hardship to a qualifying relative. So what is extreme hardship? Is there a clear definition? Is there a hardship barometer? No, it's up to the immigration officer's discretion. They say beyond what's typically expected. Okay, that's as close to a definition as one could get, but what's typically expected then? Define that. And here is where we come in. We try to level the playing field by bringing that objectivity to these proceedings. We conduct a thorough mental health evaluation, and I say psychological sometimes because I'm used to it, but I understand that non-psychologists perhaps are not supposed to use that title. But at any rate, we conduct a mental health evaluation where we objectively assess a person's strengths, weaknesses, symptoms, characterological features, etc. And we can arrive at an objective conclusion that is an objective response to the referral question. Now, they can still question that objectivity, which is extremely frustrating, but hopefully we do a good enough job so that is not the case. This work that we do is vital, especially as we enter this new chapter in our political climate. I think most immigration attorneys will agree with me that I anticipate that USCIS will scrutinize every piece of evidence that applicants present, and they will find ways to question, discredit, or minimize applicants' claims. So they will need to be super prepared. They will need as much objective evidence as they can possibly get to substantiate their claims. They will need to have a solid, robust case to avoid a request for more evidence, because I also anticipate a surge in these requests, and these delay people's processes and they come at an added cost. So we can make a difference. If you're a mental health professional who's already doing immigration evaluations, buckle up, because we're probably going to get a lot of referrals coming up. And we will hopefully make a significant difference in people's lives. And if you're not conducting evaluations yet, then this is the time. Use your skills to help level the playing field. You will see how rewarding this work is. And if you're an immigration attorney who happens to be listening to this is a time to refer your clients for mental health evaluations. You will need all the evidence that you can get to beef up these cases, because if it's been an arbitrary process so far, it will likely get a lot worse. But we can do this. That's a wrap up for today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a fellow mental health provider who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss my next episode.